The day of my brother's engagement party, I wore a navy blazer I'd bought at a Nordstrom rack 3 years ago. Not because I couldn't afford better, because I'd learned, a long time ago, that the less you look like what you are, the more clearly you can see everything around you. I drove myself to the venue, a rented ballroom at the Fairmont in downtown Chicago, and sat in my car for 4 minutes before going in. Not out of nerves, out of habit. In my line of work, you don't walk into a room without first deciding how you're going to move through it. My name is Lydia Marsh, and for most of my family, that name means very little. My brother's name is Carter. He's 3 years older than me, and growing up, he was the one our parents pointed to when they wanted to show the world what success looked like. He was pre-med at Northwestern. He ran marathons. He coached Little League on weekends, which I always thought was more about the photographs than the kids, but I kept that to myself. I was the quiet one, the one who read too much. The one who, at 17, told our father I wanted to study international relations and got a 10-minute lecture about job security and response. I ended up at Georgetown on a scholarship our parents never fully acknowledged. Georgetown, my mother said at the time, in a tone that made it sound like I'd chosen something eccentric, like taxidermy school. Well, that's interesting. After Georgetown, I went into federal public service, entry-level Department of Justice. My parents understood that as Lydia works for the government, which, to them, translated to Lydia makes $40,000 a year and has good dental. They weren't entirely wrong about the early years. I was making $42,000 my first year, sharing a one-bedroom apartment in Arlington with a law school classmate, eating a lot of rice and rotisserie chicken. I didn't tell them about the late nights, the clearance processes, the cases I couldn't talk about even if I'd wanted to. I moved up quietly. That's the only way I know how to do things. By the time Carter called to tell me about the engagement party, his girlfriend Priya's family was flying in from Boston. There would be 200 guests. It was kind of a big deal. I was 31 years old and serving as deputy director of a federal task force operating under the DOJ. My work involved financial crimes, cross-border fraud, coordination with Interpol and the FBI. I had a team of 63 people. I told my parents I'd gotten a promotion at work. My mother said, "Oh, that's wonderful, honey. Carter just got his first hospital to agree to an exclusive cardiology partnership. Isn't that exciting?" I said yes, it was very exciting. The ballroom was already full when I arrived. White orchids everywhere, which I later found out cost Priya's father $11,000. There was a jazz quartet in the corner and waitstaff circulating with champagne and little crab cakes I never got a chance to eat. I found my parents near the entrance to the main seating area. My mother hugged me the way you hug someone you're mildly glad to see. My father shook my hand. He shakes everyone's hand. It's a thing he does. "You made it," my mother said. "Carter will be so pleased." Then her eyes moved past me to scan the room. "You look tired," my father said. "Long week," I said. "Work stuff?" he asked, in the vague and curious way he always asked about my work. "Work stuff," I confirmed. We stood together for a moment in that particular silence our family is very good at. Then my mother spotted someone across the room and excused herself, and my father followed, and I was alone with a glass of champagne I didn't particularly want. I found a seat at one of the tables designated for what I can only describe as the extended family and family-adjacent category. My cousin Bex was there, which was genuinely nice. She's the only one in my family who's ever asked me a real question about my life and waited for the actual answer. Across from me was my Aunt Lorraine, who I've always found exhausting, and her husband, whose name I could never remember but who I think sold insurance. Priya's family was seated near the front. They were warm, loud in the good way, the kind of family that interrupts each other because they're too excited to wait their turn. I liked them immediately. And then there was the man seated 2 tables to my left. I noticed him the way I notice most things, quietly, with a mental note filed away. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, wearing a dark suit with a lapel pin I recognized. He was speaking with Carter's chief of staff, the man Carter had brought on to manage his practice's expansion, a guy named Patrick who wore his ambition like a second tie. Patrick was laughing a little too hard at whatever the silver-haired man was saying. I took a sip of my champagne. His name, I would later confirm from the place card, was Richard Holden, Chief Federal Magistrate Judge for the Northern District of Illinois. He was also, though I didn't know this yet, the person who was about to change the entire evening. Dinner was served around 7. I was seated between Bex and a second cousin visiting from Phoenix who wanted to talk about cryptocurrency for 45 minutes. I made sounds of acknowledgement and watched the room. My mother came to check on me once, leaning down to whisper, "Try to talk to Priya's family. Don't just sit there." As though I were a teenager at a school dance. "I've been talking," I said. "Mingle," she said. "Carter's future in-laws are very accomplished people." She said it the way she always positioned other people's accomplishments as a benchmark I was presumably not meeting. I smiled and told her I would. She moved away, and Bex leaned over. "She does know you work for the federal government, right?" "She knows I work for the government," I said. "She doesn't really distinguish between that and, like, the post office." Bex made a face. "You should tell them." "Tell them what?" "What you actually do." I shook my head. I've never been able to explain this to people outside my line of work, but the nature of what I do means that you get accustomed to being underestimated. It's not just a side effect. Sometimes it's a tool. And, honestly, part of me had stopped wanting credit from people who hadn't earned the right to give it. It was during the toast portion of the evening that things shifted. Carter stood up and gave a speech about Priya that was genuinely moving. I'll give him that. He's a good speaker. He gets that from our father. Priya's older brother gave a toast that made half the room cry. Her mother held a handkerchief and didn't use it, which I respected. Then my mother, with the particular energy she has at social events, a kind of curated warmth that performs very well in ballrooms, stood to speak. She talked about Carter's journey from childhood through medical school. She talked about the values she and my father had instilled. She mentioned the sacrifices, the long nights, the pride. She didn't mention me, which wasn't unusual, but then she turned to look at me because she knew I was watching, and she said with a smile aimed at Priya's parents, "Our Lydia is here too, of course. She works for the government." She paused. "In an office." Gentle laughter. Warm. Meant nothing probably to most people in the room. It meant something to me, not because it hurt exactly. I'd moved past hurt exactly. I'd moved past hurt years ago. But because it was so precisely, efficiently dismissive, in an office. Like I filed paperwork. Like I spent my days stamping forms and going home at 5. Bex put her hand on my arm. I looked down at my plate. After the toasts, the dancing started and the evening broke into smaller conversations. I stepped outside for air, onto the terrace that overlooked the river. The water was dark and moving, lit from below by the hotel lights. November in Chicago has its own particular cold. It comes off the lake and gets inside your coat. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes just breathing. Then my father appeared beside me. He had a scotch in his hand. He looked at the water for a moment, and I thought maybe he was going to say something real. He said, "You should think about going back to school. Carter's colleague's wife just went back for her MBA at 40. It's never too late." I turned to look at him. "I'm 31, I said. "Right," he said. "Young, lots of options still." He went back inside. I watched the water a little longer. When I returned to the ballroom, the dancing had thinned slightly and people had broken into clusters. I got a glass of water from the bar and stood near the edge of the room. And that's when I heard my name. Not my name exactly. My title. Deputy Director Marsh. I turned very slowly. Richard Holden, the magistrate judge, was standing about 8 feet away, speaking with Patrick. Patrick's back was to me, but Judge Holden was facing my direction, and his eyes had just landed on mine. He stopped mid-sentence. I watched him process what he was seeing. It took about 3 seconds, which, for a federal judge, is a very long pause. Then he said, quietly but clearly, "I'm sorry." Are you Lydia Marsh?" "I am," I said. He looked at me like a man recalibrating something fundamental. "Deputy Director Marsh, from the DOJ task force." Patrick turned around. His face did something complicated. "Yes," I said. Judge Holden crossed the room and extended his hand. His handshake was firm, formal. "I had no idea," he said. "I worked with your team on the Delacroix case. 2 years ago. Judge Whitmore said the deputy director ran the tightest operation he'd seen out of that office in 15 years. I shook his hand. "Judge Whitmore is generous." "He's not, actually," Judge Holden said. "That's why I remember him saying it." The thing about a room full of people is that a certain kind of stillness is contagious. I can't explain it except to say that I've been in enough high-stakes rooms to recognize when the air changes. And the air changed. My mother had been approaching from the left, probably to reintroduce herself to the judge, whom she'd met briefly earlier. She stopped 3 steps away. My father, who had followed her, stopped beside her. Carter was standing with Priya near the dance floor. He'd turned at the sound of the judge's voice, and Judge Holden, completely unaware of the family drama he was standing inside of, said to me, "Your unit's work on cross-border financial fraud has been cited in 3 of my colleagues' rulings this year alone. What you built is extraordinary." The reach of that task force. He shook his head. I've been hoping for an opportunity to say that in person. The room didn't freeze the way things do in movies. It was quieter than that. People nearby shifted. A conversation 2 tables over went quiet mid-sentence. My mother's face, and I watched it, because I couldn't help it, went through something I'd never seen on her before. A kind of slow rearrangement, like a building settling after an earthquake. My father set down his scotch on the nearest table. Carter stared at me. And I stood there in my Nordstrom rack blazer and accepted the compliment from a federal magistrate judge with as much grace as I could manage, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, I don't feel what I thought I would feel. There was no dramatic confrontation after that. Life isn't usually that kind. What there was a long, strange rest of the evening where the energy had quietly and irrevocably shifted. Priya's father sought me out around 9 o'clock. He was a cardiologist himself, retired from practice, now doing consulting for hospital systems, and he shook my hand warmly and told me he was glad Carter had someone like me in his corner. Family in public service, he said. That's something to be proud of. Priya hugged me at the end of the night. She'd grown up with a sister in the foreign service, she told me, and she understood the invisibility of it, the way people didn't quite know how to place you. I see you, she said, which was such a genuinely kind thing to say that I had to look away for a second. My brother came to find me while I was getting my coat. He stood in front of me for a long moment. Carter has our father's jaw and our mother's eyes, and when he's uncertain, he gets this look like he's running calculations he can't quite finish. How long? He said. How long what? How long have you been? What the judge said. That level. I thought about it. A while, I said. He was quiet. Then, I didn't know. I know you didn't. Why didn't you? Tell you. I tilted my head slightly. When would I have told you? Between the times Dad recommended I get an MBA and the times Mom introduced me as our other one, she works in an office. He flinched. It was a small flinch. Carter is not a person who flinches easily. That's fair, he said. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, I said, and I meant it. I'm just explaining why someone stops explaining. He nodded slowly. I put on my coat. Outside, the valet brought my car, a 5-year-old Honda Accord that I drove because I liked it and it was reliable, not because it was all I could afford. I sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the vindication moment to come with fireworks, with a soaring feeling, with some clean sense of justice delivered. It doesn't usually. What I felt was something more like release, like a pressure I'd been holding in my chest for a very long time had simply decreased. My mother called me the following Tuesday. She called at 7:14 in the morning, which told me she'd been thinking about it for days and had finally decided to just do it. I want to apologize, she said without preamble. I was standing in my kitchen in Georgetown making coffee. It was a gray morning, rain against the windows. Okay, I said. I didn't know, she said. About your work. About how I didn't know. I know you didn't, I said. Why didn't you tell us? I thought about this carefully. I thought about it for years, actually. There are the official reasons, classification, security, the nature of the work. And then there are the other reasons. The ones that are harder to say to your own mother. Because I spent a long time feeling like nothing I said landed, I said finally. Every time I tried to tell you something about my life, it got redirected. To Carter, or to what I should be doing instead, or to some version of me you'd already decided on. I paused. At some point, I stopped trying to update the picture. I just lived my life. There was a long silence on the line. My mother, when she speaks with real emotion, gets very quiet, not loud. She was very quiet now. That wasn't fair to you, she said. It was, genuinely, one of the most unexpected sentences she'd ever said to me. No, I agreed. It wasn't. We talked for another 20 minutes. It wasn't a resolution. You can't resolve 20 years of family dynamics in a Tuesday morning phone call, but it was real. More real than most of our conversations had ever been. When I hung up, I stood at the window for a while with my coffee and watched the rain. What I know now, and this took years, and some of it I only understand in retrospect, is that the people who tried to define me by their own limited vision of who I was were never actually seeing me. They were seeing their expectations. The two things look similar from the inside of the expectation, but from where I was standing, they were completely different. I'm not angry at my family. I want to be clear about that. Anger takes energy, and I've needed my energy for other things. For the work. For the people in my unit who rely on me to be clear-headed and present. For the cases that don't make headlines but change lives. The people who have been my real family, if I'm being honest, are the ones I met in rooms that my parents never knew I was in. My deputy, who brings terrible coffee and always knows exactly what I'm thinking before I say it. My mentor at Justice, who told me in my 3rd year that I had a rare combination of patience and precision and that I should never apologize for either. The colleagues who have seen me at 3 a.m. on a crisis call, who know what I'm made of in ways that no dinner party conversation could ever capture. You don't have to be seen by everyone. You just have to be known by the right people. Last spring, I was asked to speak at a Georgetown alumni event. It was in the same building where I'd spent most of my junior year, completely overwhelmed and absolutely certain I was in the right place. My mother came. I didn't expect her to, but she drove up from Cincinnati with my Aunt Lorraine, which must have been a particular kind of penance because Aunt Lorraine talks the entire way on road trips. I know this from experience. She sat in the 3rd row. When I walked to the podium, I found her face in the audience almost immediately. That's training, finding the familiar face in a crowd, and she was sitting very straight with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on me in a way I don't think I'd seen from her before. Not pride, exactly. Or not only that, recognition. I talked for 25 minutes about public service, about the kind of work that happens in rooms that most people don't know exist, about choosing the unglamorous path because it's the right one, about the difference between success that looks good at a party and success that actually means something when you're alone with yourself at the end of a long day. Afterward, my mother waited until everyone else had finished talking to me. She was the last person in line, which she would never have done before. She's always been someone who moves to the front. She hugged me. Longer than usual. I'm proud of you, she said. And I believe she meant it. I believe she'd been working her way toward meaning it for 6 months. I believed that the night of Carter's engagement party, something had cracked open in her understanding of me, and she'd been living inside that new information, adjusting to it, trying to figure out what it meant for how she'd seen me all these years. People can change. That's something I've had to decide to believe, because the alternative is a loneliness I'm not willing to accept. Carter called me a week after the Georgetown event. He wanted to know if I'd consult informally on a compliance issue his practice was dealing with, not DOJ territory, but he thought I'd know who to call. I did know who to call. I helped him. We talk more now. Not every week, but more. It's imperfect and a little cautious, the way things are when you're rebuilding something, but it's real, and I'll take real over perfect every time. I still drive the Honda Accord. I still buy most of my work clothes at places that don't require a valet. I still walk into rooms and take 4 minutes to myself before going in. Some things don't change because they don't need to. The work continues. The cases stack up in ways that would keep most people up at night. They keep me up at night too sometimes. But it's a different kind of awake than fear. It's more like being lit from the inside. Like knowing that what you do in the quiet, unglamorous, classified hours of your life matters in ways you'll never be able to fully explain at a family dinner. And honestly, that's enough for me. It always has been. I just needed everyone else to catch up. I've thought a lot about why that night at the Fairmont hit differently than I expected it to. I had imagined, in some version of the future I used to play out in my head, that a moment like that would feel like winning, like finally getting something I'd been owed for a long time. But standing there while Judge Holden shook my hand and my mother's face rearranged itself in real time, I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt like I'd finally just stopped losing something I should never have been losing in the first place. Here's what I've come to understand. The way other people see you is almost never actually about you. It's about what they need you to be. My parents needed me to be the quieter child, the one who didn't quite measure up, so that the measuring itself remained useful. Families do this, not out of cruelty usually, but out of habit, out of the stories they told themselves long before you were old enough to write your own. The mistake I made, and I did make it for years, was letting their story sit in the back of my mind like a second opinion I hadn't asked for. The voice that said maybe you should go back to school, or maybe the work you're doing doesn't count if no one can see it. That voice wasn't mine. I borrowed it from people who didn't have the information to have an opinion. What got me through wasn't defiance. Defiance is exhausting and it needs an audience. What got me through was just the work. Putting my head down and doing the thing in front of me as well as I possibly could, and then doing the next thing and then the next. Not for credit, not to prove something, because the work was real and the stakes were real, and that in the end is enough reason. Carter called me a failure in 100 small ways over the years, none of which he ever said out loud. That's the kind of failure that's hardest to argue with. The implied kind, the raised eyebrow, the way a room moves on from you. But I have learned that you don't argue with it. You just keep building the life you're actually living brick by quiet brick until one day someone walks into the room and calls it by its real name. Richard Holden did that. Not for me. He had no idea what he was walking into. But the universe, or cause and effect, or just the plain mathematics of time, they put him in that room on that night, and the truth came out the only way the truth ever really does, through a third party who had no reason to lie. What I want to say to anyone who is sitting right now where I sat for most of my 20s, invisible inside a family that has already decided who you are, your life is not a draft waiting for their approval. It is already the final version. The fact that they haven't read it carefully enough is their loss, not your failure. Keep going. Not loudly. Not for the moment. Just keep going because the person you are becoming is already worth more than their best guess about who you'll never be.